All right, so we left off, we had been talking about the arts and crafts movement in general, starting in England and how it proceeded into the United States. Um, and then we kind of took almost a little diversion for something completely different, as Monty Python would say, and we talked about the Beaux-Arts movement and the City Beautiful movement and Art Deco, which took us into the 1920s, even the 1930s. But we're going to kind of step back a little bit, and we're going to go back to Europe and start really talking about the origins of modernism in Europe, which then transfers over into the US as well. And so we're kind of going back. We're going to talk about the Art Nouveau movement in Europe, which really was a little bit like their arts and crafts movement on the continent. So, and especially in France, Belgium, is primarily the areas we'll talk about. It's spread throughout the continent, especially in Northern Europe. So there's areas in sort of the Germanic region, and Scandinavia was very popular as well. But it's a little bit different than just the pure arts and crafts that we talked about, but there's definitely kind of an associations between the two. And there's actually good scholarship that's come out in the last 10 years or so, that the real origins of the Art Nouveau came out of Chicago and came out of the auditorium building by Adler and Sullivan, and especially Louis Sullivan's ornamentation and decoration, and some of the craftsmen that worked on that project, you know, doing the actual implementation of different ornamentation, became known in Europe through various means, and helped to influence some of the European architects that we'll be talking about. So we're going to start in Brussels, which is kind of the origin in Europe of the Art Nouveau movement. And by the way, Art Nouveau is just French for new art. It sort of refers to the idea that this is a kind of a new form of art and architecture that would be not based on anything tied to the past. So this is not unlike say the Beaux-Arts movement, which was a continuation of classical Greek and Roman architecture, an interpretation of that, or other revival styles that we talked about, you know, Gothic revival and so forth, Romanesque revival. The Art Nouveau would be a new form of art and architecture that did not, you know, use previous movements and styles as a basis. And so one of the first buildings considered to be truly Art Nouveau in Europe is by Victor Horta from 1892, the Tassel House in Brussels, Belgium. So here is Monsieur Horta, looking very dapper, and really was one of the first European architects to adopt this new style. And like what we saw with the sort of arts and crafts, and especially the prairie style movement that we talked about with Frank Lloyd Wright, this really wasn't just ornamentation on buildings. This was really about developing a new way of living, a new kind of architecture that was more modern and more reflective of the turn of the 20th century that was about to happen, you know, the 1890s, early 1900s. And people were starting to sort of say, hey, it's time, we live differently, we've gone through the Industrial Revolution, it's time to have a new kind of architecture. And so people like Horta really looked at how that could be reflected, that sort of new way of living could be reflected in architecture. And hopefully that'll become clear as I show you some of these examples. So here is the exterior view of the Tassel House. And as you can, I think, see, this isn't really anything like we have seen before. It certainly doesn't have any precedent in the earlier types of architecture that we discussed either this semester or in the fall semester. It has some, you know, good symmetry. You know, there's a straight line down the middle. It's well organized. It's not quite so random, but it really has a completely new kind of ornament, which I think we can see in this detail photo better here, where the columns, they don't have Ionic or Corinthian orders or something from Greek or Rome. Roman, just sort of a naturalist, and that's kind of the hallmark of the Art Nouveau movement, is they look to nature for their inspiration, much the same way that Louis Sullivan was doing in a very organic way, and that Frank Lloyd Wright was doing in a very geometrically abstracted way. So we see kind of almost like leaves or roots almost here on the tops and bottoms of these stone capitals. And then even in the ironwork along the railing here, just near the top, is this beautiful sort of just lines and curves, somewhat organic, but not a literal interpretation at all. And the other thing I like to point out about the Tassel house is this lintel right here on the bay window. That's the steel lintel, and you can even see the rivets. Here's something that's pretty new, expressing and exposing the structural system as part of the architecture itself, and not hiding it in walls, or it's on the back of the building and nobody cares, or it's an industrial building and nobody really cares, as far as a factory building. And so as we talk on here later today, we'll see that this concept right here taken to an extreme, right, and really glorifying the industrial aesthetic, but here it's at least being expressed even in a slight way. And this is the interior stairwell view, which a very famous Art Nouveau interior view. If you Google Art Nouveau, you'll probably get a view like this as an early hit, because the Tassel house is so important. But this really shows the decorations. Again, some of these almost vine-like decorations on the walls, the ceilings, the column capitals again turn into the same kind of vines. They stretch out here, and then they're bundled down to a base, and even the mosaic of the floor has that theme throughout. And even, if you look at the stair, the way it sort of curves down and around. So the entire architecture, interior, exterior, is really this organic form, and we'll see how that can be taken to extremes here momentarily. His own house was kind of his laboratory. It's always good to look at an architect's own house to see what he does for himself or herself. This is from 1898, finished in 1901, also in Brussels. So here's the exterior, and we can see a lot of similarities in the exterior to the Tassel house. The form is similar. We got stonework, we have a bay window, and in the detail photo, we can see even more organic ornamentation in the doorway, and this little canopy over the door with the glass lights, and the ironwork of both of the railing on the left, and also supporting the bay window above that. All these vines and naturalist elements are really becoming a major feature here on the exterior. And we see that carried on the interior as well. I got to tour this house a few years ago, but unfortunately they didn't allow photographs on the interior. But this is a great view. You can see the same, handrails have this wrought iron that's curved and bent in vine-like forms. Even the railing itself looks like it's sort of grown naturally out of the floor, like a trunk of a thick vine, and it's growing off in a different direction, and you've got all the little leaves of the railings. The beam on the top here is sort of expressing that same way, as well as the arch, the vaulting and the arches here. This isn't just standard Roman or Gothic vaulting. It almost begins to take on some of that same organic character. But I also want to point out the openness of this plan, and that it was something we talked about with Frank Lloyd Wright, remember, and that he developed the concept of an open floor plan for homes, not breaking up rooms into separate little rooms and parlors with doorways and hallways connecting everything. He really opened up the space, and he would separate them by features like a fireplace or a built-in or something like that. So there was a little bit of a physical and visual separation, but yet they were still more or less united. And we see the same kind of thing applied here. Horta is working as a contemporary to Wright, so he's coming up with the same kinds of ideas and concepts at the same time Wright is. it's sometimes, especially here in Chicago Oak Park, we get a little over obsessed with Frank Lloyd Wright. He did this and he did this and he did this. He did all those things, but he wasn't living in a vacuum, and other people were having similar ideas and coming to the same conclusions that Wright was. But Wright was he was a good self-promoter, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And he was incredibly talented, but he certainly was not, doing everything just by himself. So we see a real openness in the plan here, a really open staircase here that connects the different levels. We can see off and into the dining room beyond a couple levels down. Horta was really good about using different levels to help break up space. That's a good way, if you don't have walls separating spaces, using levels is a way to do that. And here is that dining room that we saw off in the distance there. And the thing I like to point out about this dining room is if you look at what the materials are on the walls and ceilings, it's that white subway tile, right? And famous, as the literal subway tile in, like the New York City or Paris metro, but also in, bathrooms and kitchens, right? You see it all the time. They still make reproductions of this tile that you can put in your bathroom or kitchen, especially if you're working on a house from this vintage. But to see it in a formal living space like a dining room, is really unusual, and to see it on the walls and ceilings. This is tile that was common in kitchens and bathrooms where you want sanitary, clean, easily cleaned materials, but to put it in a formal space like a dining room here was really a radical innovation. I do. I mean, it's a little bit overwhelming, I guess, Bea, how it looks. Here's another view. This is actually, I think, a little offshoot here, a little sitting area off to the side. And this, maybe he was inspired because this was being used in the vaulted spaces of the, Paris Metro, or, I'm sure other metros were using this as well. And so maybe he said, hey, I'm going to reproduce this in a house, in my own house. And he could experiment. It was his own house, and it was, didn't have to worry about whether his clients liked it. So it's sort of just shows that, though, that innovative thinking that these architects had. And the last I want to show here is up, but this is the top of the stair with a nice skylight to really let lots of natural light illuminate the stairwell. You can see there's a cool mirror, outlined in this organic form, and that's reflecting the light fixture here. Really cool light fixture. Again, bare light bulbs almost, but at least the fixture elements itself are this natural vine-like elements. And of course, you see the stenciling on the walls, and the window on the left is kind of an odd shape as well. So I want to show you just a few other images, just random images of the Art Nouveau in Brussels. This was like I say, it sort of emerged out of Brussels before it became real popular in Paris and in other European cities. And a few years ago, when I was in Brussels with my wife, we took an Art Nouveau tour. Just like the Chicago Architecture Center has various tours you can take. So you hop on a bus and they take you around all the neighborhoods in Brussels. It was a great way to see a lot of this incredible Art Nouveau architecture. And we were able to go in a few houses as part of the tour. This one we weren't able to, but I thought this one was pretty cool. It's a pretty narrow little row house here, but they maximized the space, I guess, with these projecting balconies. But they really went overboard, I thought, on the wrought iron work of these balconies here. And it really gives you a sense of just how far the architects here were willing to take this organic vine-like ornamentation. Even the staircase is sort of curved at an angle. This is another house. This was the house of I believe he was a plaster tradesman. And so the outside of his house is covered in stucco, and in the details here you can see that he did this sort of Art Nouveau decoration in the stucco work to showcase the work that he could do. This is a detail up at the top showing allegories of the different arts. And so I think we see sculpture over here on the left. There's music over here. Painting, she's holding a paint palette and brushes, and then we have a woman standing near the right holding a building, so she's representing architecture. I thought that was a really cool, and there's other arts and trades here. I thought that was a great way to ornament a building with beautiful women representing arts and culture. So probably the most famous of the Art Nouveau architects would be Antonio Gaudi, a Catalan architect out of Barcelona. And his great work that's still not finished is the Sagrada Familia church in Barcelona. This was started in 1882, and only a little bit was completed during Gaudi's lifetime, and it is still ongoing. I first saw Sagrada Familia in 1990, and I've been back several times since then, and a lot has changed. When I went there, there was almost nothing of the nave and the vaulting. None of that existed, just sort of the facades, and not even all of the facades. So it's been kind of interesting to watch in, 30 years since I first saw it, how much it's gotten done. So here's an image of Antonio Gaudi. Catalonia is a region of Spain, which they're constantly asking for their independence, but right now it's a part of Spain as it was back then. Gaudi was very much influenced by the arts and crafts movement, and by Ruskin. We talked about his writings early on, as well as sort of melding that with medieval and Gothic architecture and how to sort of create a new architecture out of these ideas. Again, concepts that we talked about when we talked about more traditional arts and crafts movement, and really looking at and romanticizing medieval construction and Gothic architecture. But no one is going to mistake Sagrada Familia for a Gothic church, for sure, even though there are certain elements that you can see that inspiration. So here's a view of it that I took a few years ago when I last visited, and you can see this is just a side aisle entrance, one of the transept entrances, and this is the part that was completed by Gaudi in the 1920s before he died. And then you can see a little bit of the nave that has been completed since I first saw it. Mostly to the designs of Gaudi, but obviously not under his direct supervision. Gaudi designed the entire church. There are models, there are some drawings, there's a lot of information about what his vision for this church was. And after his death, it actually sort of petered out for a while, especially with the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. And it really wasn't until after the Franco died in the 1970s, the dictator that won the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, that we really started to see a major construction initiative start again here. And that's partly why this has taken so long to build, because there was a gap really of several decades. So here's a more close-up view of the transept facade that he completed. This is the Nativity facade, known as the Nativity facade, because they use the Nativity scene of the New Testament birth of Jesus as the inspiration for the ornamentation on here. It's still a construction site, so even at the top here, they've covered, they've wrapped the top of the columns. It's not what it's supposed to be, but you can see the forms underneath it. You can see a lot of scaffolding here on these images as well. And then I have a few detail images. I always sort of explain this facade as like Gaudi sort of sculpted this in wax, and then he heated it up and partially melted it. If you can imagine that, then you can imagine the Nativity facade that Gaudi created here. And some of it's almost, pretty realistic sculptural elements, right in here in this element. But when you look at sort of what's surrounding it and the elements on the left here, it does look a little bit like hot wax that's been partly melted and beginning to ooze and drip down. have a few more details of this. So again, you see some of the sculptural elements of the different nativity scenes, but heralding the birth of Christ here with the trumpets and so forth. But then you look, there's ferns and there's, tree branches and leaves and roots and things like that. And again, all sort of sculpted in a way to make it look like it's sort of half melted. Here's a scene of Mary holding little baby Jesus, I guess. So the parts that I didn't see initially and got to see a few years ago when I returned is the nave, which has been essentially completed, the vaulting in the nave. And you can see that this is just really, to me, this is just really wild. It's organic, it's a little bit, you can see some of the inspiration of Gothic architecture. It's almost like pointed vaulting. It's almost like the bundled columns and then, fanned out, fan vaulting that we talked about last semester. But, clearly this is not Gothic revival. It's very organic inspired and almost like organic inspired, but it's not like he took an actual tree and interpreted that or something. He's, you've got these little bulbs forms here, and then they sort of shoot out from there. It's really hard to know exactly what he was thinking when he was designing some of these elements. There is a really good little museum area outside that you can walk in, and they do show you some of the organic inspirations that Gaudi was working with that helps explain some of the elements that you see around the building. So here we got a little better view of the vaulting and of you see the apse down at the end with a really beautiful light coming in and illuminating this mosaic of a sort of almost looks like a Christmas tree there at the far end. And here's a view standing in a side aisle looking up at the main vaulting of the nave here up at the top, and you see the side aisle vaulting. It's formed like a regular Gothic, or early Christian church. It has a nave, it has side aisles, transept, apse, all the elements that we talked about last semester are in this church. It's just not built like any church had ever been built before. All right. A couple other examples, his two probably most famous examples in Barcelona. One is the Casa Batllo. This was designed, built between 1904 and 1906. This is right in central Barcelona on the Passeig de Gràcia, which is like their main boulevard. And this is, it's a private home, but it's also a little bit of an apartment. So the Batllo family lived on the premier etage, which is what we would call the second floor, and then they were able to rent out apartments on the upper floors. It's a pretty good deal. I mean, we talked about the Greystone 2 flats, right, when we did our walking tour. The way that was a way for working class families to afford their own home because they could potentially rent out the second floor or first floor as an apartment for income, or if they had an extended family, they could all live and have privacy but still live in the same building. The Batllos weren't working class; they were the wealthy 1%. But the same concept applied here. Even they needed income, I guess. But when we look at the outside of this is just crazy. I mean, you can see the hordes of tourists that are outside this. So Barcelona is already popular enough as a tourist destination, and there's just long lines to get in here if you don't pre-purchase your ticket online. And let me show you some details of the facade. Most of the facade is actually mosaic tile. All these different colors here are tile mosaics, and then the balconies look like skull heads of some sort of exotic, fish or creature. What you can, these are, Gaudi is like the Rorschach test of architecture. When you see the ink blot and you're supposed to tell your psychiatrist what it is you think you see. That's what we're really looking here with Gaudi, and what do you see in here is a very personal thing, I guess. So, but most definitely the Batllo house here had a sort of nautical theme, like a 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea kind of thematic, which we'll see a little better when I show you the interior photos. And even this image here, you can see all the sort of art glass in these circles that we'll have a better view of. Looks like bubbles under the water when we see it from the inside. But notice, not a square element here at all. No right angles. Everything is curved. Um, Absolutely probably had to add mass costs to these projects. I mean, even this is all stonework around it. Can you imagine working, Gaudi had to be pretty much on site, constantly working with the stonemasons to get them to craft this just right, because, this is long before AutoCAD. Nowadays we could probably model this in CAD or other software, right? And they could craft it from that, maybe even do laser cutting and stuff like that just based off the CAD software. This was all done by hand. You can only imagine trying to draw this by hand, but much less, have a craftsman then build it. So the level and intensity of working with the trades here was significant, which meant it was an architecture for the elites, people like the Batllo family that could afford it. This was definitely not something that was affordable for more working class ordinary families. This is on the roof. This has a really nice little roof deck. This is the top of the building. We're looking at it from the back. So these are chimney caps, all tiled. The roof. A lot of people think the roof spine here is a little bit like a dragon spine, and it's got the scales of a dragon and so forth. Like I say, you can come up with all kinds of crazy things of what you interpret here. Maybe like a Tolkien, Lord of the Rings sort of environment, perhaps too. So here's a floor plan. This is the main floor level, so the premier étage. The main stair comes up here where it says number 2 into an entry hall or vestibule. And then the front of the building we were seeing, this is the main living room here with those crazy windows in the front. There's sort of a central core of a common stair, an elevator for the tenants and so forth. And then at the back is the dining room and kitchen spaces, and then there's other bedrooms and stuff. There's also, I think the second level is part of the bedroom wing for the Batllo family as well. So here is the main staircase as you go up, and you can see some of the things we saw earlier with Horta's architecture. Here's a steel structural element that is organic and expressive. So they're taking a structural thing that's pretty plain and basic and turning it into something very artistic. We see the tiles on the wall that are beginning to reflect that nautical theme. They look like they're water. And then here is the entry vestibule with this little ingle nook. We talked about ingle nooks a bit, especially with Frank Lloyd Wright, where you have a fireplace as the hearth of the heart of the home. Here we have that again with this little cool mushroom shape that you could go in and sit in there. I can only imagine the Batllo children growing up here must have thought this was a fun house. And then this is in the living room. So this is the inside view of those art glass windows we were seeing in these sort of circular forms. And you can see now with the light coming through that they have over on the left, you can see it maybe best, almost seashell-like forms, right? So are you looking at bubbles? Are you looking at shells? It's a little bit of both. And it's just an incredible space to be in. Here's a historic view of it furnished. As it is for tours, they don't have it furnished. So this gives you a little sense of how the Batllos. This is actually the dining room in the back, but you can see some of the furniture that Gaudi would have designed, like Frank Lloyd Wright designed furniture, like Macintosh designed furniture. Of course, this is a little more organically inspired furniture that fits with the theme of the house. And then one more view of that front window. You can see it's not even a straight wall, right? It's an angled wall. So I mean, this is really three-dimensional. I still am blown away at how they could create this, at that time without the use of computer software and so forth. And these windows open. This is up at the top is a pocket, and you can actually open these windows and slide them up into the pocket up top. I mean, it's just incredible, the craftsmanship and detail that's here. So just down the block, maybe like 1 or 2 blocks away, also on the Passeig de Gràcia in Barcelona, is the Casa Mila from 1905. This is actually an apartment. This is a full-scale apartment building, whereas the Casa Batllo was somebody's home, but they happened to have apartments that they would rent out. This was, you know, a more speculative apartment building. This is the floor plan, not a straight angle in this building. You can imagine the contractor getting a set of plans and going, what am I supposed with this, right? And you can see here too that this is a very skeletal form. The dark spots here in the center and on the left are the sort of open light courts for the interiors, and then you can see there's kind of passageways for the apartments that go around the light courts, and then on the outside you can see various rooms. I can't tell you how many, but there's numerous apartments shown in this, just in this floor plan. There's probably 4, 5, 6 apartments on each floor on this building, and it sits on a corner, on a very prominent corner here. So it's almost an L shape, and the corner, as we talked about when we talked about planning, 19th century planning, the Eixample in Barcelona, all the corners are clipped. So they're not just right angle corners. You know, Gaudi is just taking off from where the Eixample started, no right angles. So indeed, the corner, he just sort of spins this organic form around and makes it look just very natural here. Here's a nice detail. Again, incredible stonework here. Not a single rectangular block of stone at all on this building, and beautiful ironwork for the balconies that look like they're growing out of the stone itself. And the roof deck here is one of the most famous and popular roof decks in Barcelona. And again, this is a building you can tour. There's still people living in some of the apartments, but one of the apartments is open for tours, and you can go up to the roof deck as well. And you can see the different chimneys here. This is the light court here with little tiny windows, almost like little dormer windows in the attic space, and then the full windows of the light court that you see below. And then here's some of the chimney caps that, again, what do you see here? Actually, here's a good, a lot of people see something that came out of a very popular movie in the 1970s when I was growing up. Anyone want to stab a guess? Anyone remind you of any space-like creatures? Anyone still there?
They look like faces to me, but I don't know what.
Yeah, there's probably a better one. I didn't include it, but a lot of people think these look like the stormtroopers from Star Wars. The sort of masks, helmets, or whatever that the stormtroopers wore. These not so much. There's a few. I'll have to find a photo for you that look a little bit like stormtroopers. So there's some thought that George Lucas was saw this and was pretty inspired by it as he was coming up with his fantastical creatures in outer space. Here's another one. This one doesn't look like a stormtrooper, but you can certainly see a face here. This almost looks like those heads on Easter Island or something like that. It's got a little mouth, and you can see the eyebrows and nose up there. They're just incredible sculptural elements on the roof there. All right, so moving on a little bit, we'll go to Vienna, Austria, and the work of Otto Wagner, and especially his Stadtbahn entrances. Stadtbahn is the underground, rail system, their metro system. They call it the Stadtbahn. And these were built between 1894 and 1901. And Otto Wagner, an image of him here, he was kind of the grandfather of what's known as the Viennese Secessionist movement. And this is all part of the Art Nouveau movement, which again is really essentially part of the arts and crafts movement, an offshoot of that. And Viennese, what the secessionist movement really refers to is that this group of artists and architects seceded from the sort of established artistic and cultural establishment, right? You know, there were art guilds and architecture societies and so forth. And, you know, generally in old Europe, you know, if you wanted to be an artist, if you wanted to be an architect or something like that, or a sculptor, you were part of your guild or your trade group or whatever. And, you know, they put on exhibitions that you would compete to get, you know, a place, you know, to display your work. Well, you know, these new young artists, you know, and architects and so forth, they were creating this wild stuff, and the establishment was like, we don't like this. This is not right. You know, you can't do it this way. And so they said, well, fine, we'll just break off and we'll start our own group. And so they became known as the Secessionists in Vienna. And so, but it's basically part of this Art Nouveau style. And Otto Wagner was kind of a senior architect. He was already elderly by the time this movement started in the 1890s, but he was kind of seen as like the leader of these younger artists and architects who looked up to him and said, oh, you know, let's, you know, lead us into this new stuff, you know, and these new ideas. And partly it's because of his work on the Stadtbahn entrances. So as this new subway system was being built in Vienna, they hired Wagner, who was an established architect. You know, he was part of the system, right? But he came up with these creative Art Nouveau little pavilions that became the entrances for the Stadtbahn. So here we see the Karlsplatz, you know, Stadtbahn entrance. And you know, similar elements to the Art Nouveau that we've talked about, especially related more to Victor Horta than Antonio Gaudi. Gaudi was smoking something. He was way out there in his fantasy world. You know, Horta and, you know, Otto Wagner were a little more restrained. So we see more straight lines and right angles, which of course makes these a little easier to build. But still, that same kind of vine-like organic ornamentation, stenciling on the exterior stucco, the columns here, these steel columns here at the entrance, you know, that then, you know, turn into vines at the top and so forth. So, you know, again, nothing classical, neoclassical, Beaux-Arts, very much a new kind of architecture, a new kind of ornament. Here's a detail of the stucco ornamentation and some of the gilded wrought iron decoration on the exterior. Here's the top of one of those columns we were looking at. Now that turns into a vine. It's really beautiful stuff. If you get the chance when you travel Europe, you know, to see some of this Art Nouveau in person, it's just gorgeous. So that was Otto Wagner, but really one of the most impressive works out of this Viennese Secessionist movement was by Josef Olbrich in 1897, and that was to create a building to house this group of artists and architects that got together and formed the Viennese Secessionist movement. So they needed a guild hall, a place to exhibit their works and do shows and exhibitions and so forth. And so this up-and-coming architect, Josef Olbrich, was hired to do that. And he was one of the co-founders and was charged with creating the hall for that. Olbrich, you know, died relatively young, unfortunately, kind of sadly, and not too long after the secessionist movement began to break apart. You know, it was a little glorious moment of about 10 years or so where these people were, you know, worked together, got together, and then, you know, things moved on. People went different directions. You know, styles changed and so forth. And as we'll see, World War I destroys all of this, you know, in a very literal sense, but also, you know, figuratively ending this whole movement completely. But here is the Secessionist Hall. It's a little more straightforward. It has a lot of geometric massing that you know, that we'll later see Frank Lloyd Wright use at Unity Temple almost, right? You know, and Unity Temple is, you know, 1909. I think he just started designing it a little sooner than that, but you know, this is 1897. So this also helps put into context that Frank Lloyd Wright was not just, you know, creating all this brand new out of his head. He was seeing things. Some of this work would have been published, especially in magazines and trade periodicals that Wright would have been looking at, that he would have been more interested in this kind of work than he would have been in, neoclassical architecture. So, this is stucco. This isn't concrete. So Wright's innovation at Unity Temple was even greater than this, but it's still an incredible work of art. You can see the stenciling on the corners and the sort of gilded stenciling around the entranceway. The thing that I could never quite figure out when I was in architecture school at your age was what was going on the roof, this big ball of twine or whatever this was. And, professors back when I was in school had slides, first like real slides, and, the images were not great. This is my image I took, with a digital camera just a few years ago. But it was always, I could never figure out what was really happening on the top. And it's just a bunch of leaves created into this big spherical ornament on top of the building. And it really wasn't until I first saw it that I was like, oh, that's actually pretty cool. So if this looks a little weird to you, then, go see it in person. I highly recommend it. This was partly damaged during World War II, but was beautifully restored since then. You can see over the entranceway, it has almost a Beaux-Arts planning here. You've got a, symmetry, central axis. You've got, a grand staircase leading to a sort of fairly grandiose entryway. So, a lot of these architects emerged out of the Beaux-Arts training program, whether they went to the Sorbonne, and in Paris or not, or whether they, most schools were teaching the Beaux-Arts method. But they broke from that. They said, hey, I don't want to do neoclassical architecture, but their planning and their organizational skills were definitely honed in the Beaux-Arts manner. And we have these beautiful, I got a better photo of it here next. These beautiful heads showing the different arts that are on display in here. And some of the gilded ornament that's on the exterior. Here's a detail of that gilded leaf dome. Again, I'm still not sure really what's going on here, why he put this on here. I'll have to look this up one day to figure out what he was thinking when he put this on here. But it always made me wonder what the heck this was when I was a student. The interiors have been sort of partly restored. They were badly damaged during the war from an Allied bomb. So this is a historic view. This was a great loss because the murals in here all across the walls were done by Gustav Klimt, the great artist. I'll talk a little more about Klimt here in a moment. But he was part of the Viennese Secessionist movement. So if you're familiar with Klimt as an artist, the entire interior was his work. And there are images of this that exist, like this one here. So we kind of know what it looked like, but it was all destroyed, unfortunately, during an Allied bombing. So another Viennese secessionist was Josef Hoffmann. But this project is actually back in Brussels. We're kind of going full circle here and going back into Brussels. This is the Palais Stoclet from 1905, finished in 1911 by Viennese architect Josef Hoffmann. He was actually born in Czech, which at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is, again, before World War I. World War I would not just end this movement of architecture, but it would end the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Czech, became independent at that time, Czechoslovakia. Now it's the Czech Republic. But because he was part of the empire, he moved to Vienna, where the work was and where he could really make it, and so became very, very successful. He was, again, a co-founder of the Viennese Secessionist movement, and then later what was known as the Wiener Werkstatt, which translates to Vienna Workshop, which was really a continuation after the secessionist movement ended about 1903. There were the ideas didn't completely die off, and so people like Hoffmann created a continuation, a work group. that would be a center for design for artists and architects and interior designers and craftspeople that were like-minded, that wanted sort of a modernist aesthetic or a modern new type of architecture and art and design. And so this would really become almost a precursor to the Bauhaus movement in Germany that we'll talk about, I think, even a little later today here. So this is the Palais Stoclet, which is, the Stoclet is the family, just the Stoclet Palace in Belgium. I think this might be Flemish, a little bit French Flemish. You never can tell which language they're speaking in Belgium, but it's a single family palace home, you know, in a sort of almost suburban area of outlying suburban area of Brussels. And this is a masterpiece of Art Nouveau, but really moving into that Viennese Secessionist. The Viennese Secessionists began to drop off some of the extravagant, extraneous, organic ornamentation. We still see a little bit here, but we can start to see an evolution to a more geometric, more straightforward facade here. We're not to European modernism yet, but we're getting closer, right? Here is an aerial view. You can see it's quite a large house. This is the main street along here, so it has a little bit of a breezeway that comes out to an entrance gate. Very private. This is still privately owned and has never been open to the public. There are interior images I'll show you, but unlike many of the other buildings I've been showing you that are now open as house museums and quite popular, this is still very private and has, to my knowledge, has never been opened for any kind of public viewing. There is this, tower over here that's one of the few sort of design organic elements here, and just an extensive array of gardens and so forth that sprawl out as well. There's a couple of details. These are some of my photos, as close as I can get outside the fence, of the exterior and of the tower element. So we see a little bit of organic ornament along the edges and a little bit on the railings, and this beautiful bronze sculptural work up here on top. Almost a little bit of like that laurel wreath dome that we saw at the Secessionist Hall by Olbrich is being repeated here by Hoffmann at the Palais Stoclet. Not quite literal and much smaller, so open and fine filigree, but it's very similar. You can almost see the inspiration there. So here's the floor plan. We see on the bottom is the ground floor. So the street is down at the bottom. Here's that entry breezeway that leads you into an entrance hall. And then the main living room is here, sort of on the center left. You can see a staircase and a music hall. The dining room is over here in the center upper. It leads out to a terrace. And then we have, rooms off of that. And of course, on the upper floors are the various bedrooms and so forth. So here's a few images that do exist of the interiors. Beautifully, the interior, this is the main living room, covered in beautiful veined marble. Not the subway tile like the Victor Horta house. This is the kind of materials that one might expect to see in a very wealthy home. Really rich, beautiful marble. Nicely planned and organized. Again, these guys came out of that Beaux-Arts training, so their spaces are incredibly well organized and relate to each other, but they break from any kind of historical association that the Beaux-Arts had. Here's some black and white views that don't show off the space a little bit. There's the staircase on the left. And again, more of a view of that living room with the bay window looking out into the gardens there that we see on the right. And then the dining room. This is a historic view of the dining room with the original furniture that Hoffmann would have probably designed and would have been created as part of the Wiener Werkstatt. He would have had furniture makers and artisans that would have done the various work on this. And this is a project that would have kept a lot of them very busy. But it's also incredibly famous for what's on the walls. Just like we talked about at the Secessionist Hall, Gustav Klimt was hired to do painted murals on the walls of the dining room. And here is a more contemporary view in color, and you see the original Klimt paintings on the walls. I mean, these are one percenters here for sure, but pretty amazing to have. I mean, an art museum would kill to have some of this artwork in their galleries that they can put on display for, the hordes of tourists that come through. And this is a private dining room. And here's a detail of the Klimt murals that are in the dining room here. So you can see sort of a tree of life here in the center, and a female figure over on the and an embrace over on the right. These, you see these in prints and reproductions of Klimt's work quite a bit. And of course, Klimt is famous, and again, he is part of this Viennese Secessionist and Wiener Werkstatt movement, where he's creating an art that is completely modern. Taking off where the Impressionists out of France started in the 1870s and 80s, and creating fanciful creations, very organic and flowing, heavily gilded. A lot of Klimt's work was heavily gilded here. Definitely not the work of the Renaissance, right? The figures and images here are not, anatomically pure and correct the way Michelangelo was doing and Bernini in the Baroque period. These are almost abstractions, and really many people consider to be some of the most beautiful artwork ever created. And this is obviously his most famous work, The Kiss, with the embrace here. These two figures were not, in the Palais Stoclet. These were just paintings that he did. And these are in museums. If you go to Vienna, I believe these are in the Belvedere Museum, which is one of the great art museums in the world, where you can see a lot of Klimt's work. Okay, so the last architect I want to talk about as part of this movement is Adolf Loos. He is also out of Vienna. I believe he might have been from Czech too. I can't remember offhand, but one of the most important and a very influential architect that came out of the Viennese Secessionist movement. I don't believe he was part of the Wiener Werkstatt, but he definitely he was one of those who was part of the Secessionist, and then he went off and really into his own direction, which was to eschew ornament completely. Whereas, we just saw with Josef Hoffmann, he was like, yeah, I'm getting rid of some of the extraneous ornament, but I still want decorations and so forth. Adolf Loos created a book that translates it to Ornament and Crime from 1913, in which he basically made the statement that to put ornamentation onto a building is a criminal, akin to a criminal act. That architecture ought to be pure, it ought to reflect the structure and the form and the function of a building, and ornament is just a distraction. It's just a way for architects to cover up their mistakes, right? And he was much influenced by the Chicago school architects, and ironically, by Louis Sullivan, because Sullivan was an ornamentalist, as we saw, especially like at the Schlesinger and Mayer or Carson Perry Scott department store down on State Street, with that incredibly Art Nouveau-like bronze ornament along the storefronts. Well, he was influenced by that, but then he broke from that and he said, you know what? I like the formality and the planning that Louis Sullivan was doing, and if you stripped off the ornamentation, it would be perfect. Is the best way to kind of come up with that. So I want to show you a couple of examples of his work. One is the Steiner House in Vienna from 1910. And this is a view of the front of the house. So no ornament on this building. he hasn't written his book yet from 1913, but he's already coming to the conclusion that that architecture can be beautiful without, extraneous ornament. One doesn't need to apply beauty to architecture. Architecture can, in its forms, in its shape, and its massing, can be beautiful in itself. A work of art, a work of sculpture. And so we see that a little bit here. We've got this, curved roof form that comes down with a sort of almost dormer-like window that pops up, just simple rectangular openings in an otherwise plain, unordained stucco wall, and just a very simple geometries and cubical type of massings. And that's the direction that Loos goes in the early 1900s. This is an elevation of the rear of the facade, which is, a taller, the grade drops off from the front. So it's actually 3 stories in the back. And it is almost looks like an apartment building, a modern apartment building. It's got a pipe railing along the top almost. It's just got rectangular openings. If I showed you this drawing and I said, what do you think this dates from? You might say certainly late half of the 20th century, maybe even 21st century. And this is a historic view of that. So here you see the back. You can see that curved roof form that's over there on the front, but just real simple elevations and geometries. And that's what Loos becomes known for and becomes quite influential to the modernist architects that are soon to emerge, mostly out of Germany. His most famous work is the Loos House. This is not his own house. This sort of got named this way because it was associated with him. This is really a commercial building in downtown central Vienna from 1910. And it sits on a very prominent plaza in central Vienna. And, it has several stories with on top with a beautiful base of, green veined marble. This has just a little tiny bit of ornamentation to it in the columns here, which are really kind of a Doric order. But you can see by the time he gets to the second floor, or the upper floors, I mean, he's gone right back to what he was doing at the Steiner house. Just simple, plain stucco walls, simple rectangular openings, does not cover the building in ornamentation and so forth that we were seeing with the earlier Art Nouveau architecture. Here's a little more detailed view of that. The marble is gorgeous. And that's part of his philosophy, is that, if you use fantastic materials like this beautiful marble, you don't need to apply ornament to the building. The material becomes the ornament and the decoration itself. And so he doesn't oppose beautiful buildings, he just opposes doing it unnaturally. So here's an example of how you can do that really quite lovely. And I like this photo here because we see his design on the left compared to the more Beaux-Arts, somewhat neoclassical architecture that was very popular in Vienna and much of Europe in the years before World War I. What a contrast, right? And again, if I showed this to you, you might say, "Oh, wow, that's a modern building." Well, this dates from 1910, so this is pretty groundbreaking in its architecture. And if I go back, I should have thrown the slide in. If I go back to this view right here, remember when I showed you the Tribune Tower competition slides from 1922, I think it was, 23? Loos entered an image. It was kind of a joke entry, and he used his Loos house design as the base, and then he put a giant Doric column on the top of it as kind of a thumbing his nose at this competition, because he knew that some revival style was going to be picked, which it was. It was a Gothic revival architecture, so wasn't the Doric column Greek revival, but that was his joke of a competition entry. The last example I want to show you by Loos is the Muller house. This is in Prague, in now Czech Republic, from 1928. So this is jumping ahead a little bit. And by this time, he has completely eliminated anything that would look like ornamentation or decoration. And really, we're seeing a very early modernist, functionalist piece of architecture that I'll be talking more about here just in a few minutes. So here we see, simple cubic geometric forms, just real simple openings in that wall. They're even randomized. We don't have this sort of Beaux-Arts, organization and planning anymore. This is a much more randomized. If you need a window, you put a window in. Doesn't matter where it goes. That's part of the beauty of the house. That's part of that form ever follows function philosophy that he still kept from Louis Sullivan. I love this. We got a historic view of it. It sits on a prominent hill overlooking the river valley in Prague, and you can see. I love the old car here, and it. This is 1928. And look how modern this looks. It's these early modernist houses. When I look at these historic photos, just blow me away. So this is open to the public. I took a tour. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to take picture photos on the inside, but here's a few of my photos. And this is the entrance. So again, he's using a beautiful travertine marble here, and he uses it in a very decorative way. Look at the way he sort of places it on the wall here. This is like a little bench where you can sit and take your coat or shoes off before you go inside. And it's, there's no applied ornament here, but it's still a very beautiful arrangement, both in its design and its placement and use of marble. The floor plan is very, very complex. Like we saw with the Horta architecture early on, Loos uses different levels as a way to help differentiate spaces. It's a complex thing that I can't really explain to you in just a couple of minutes of planning here, but here's a section that gives you a little bit of an idea of how many levels are in this house. So you come in at this level right here. This is that entrance we just saw. You actually go up a half a flight onto a main level with a living room, but then you go up another half a flight to a dining room. You can go up another half a flight. There's a little office that overlooks the dining room. You go up another half a flight, then you're into the bedroom wing, and so on and so on. It's kind of like the split level house of the 1960s and 70s almost, except this is from 1928. So here's an image. This is standing in the living room looking at the opening into the dining room, a half a level up on the left, and then a half a level beyond that is this opening to this little office space that still has a vista down into the living room. And you can see the beautiful rich marbles that he's using on the interior here as well. Here's another view of that living room. So again, this looks like it could be out of, the mid-century, late 20th century rather than 1928. Just a few more views, some historic views, some more contemporary views. All right, so it covers not just Loos, but the Art Nouveau movement. And you can see, I hope you saw that progression. And we're getting closer and closer to a more modernist aesthetic, which is what we'll be talking about here in a moment.